The bolt cutters snapped through my chain like it was paper. I watched from across the street as Sheriff Karen tossed my lock into the gutter and climbed into my vintage Jeep. My hands shook as I pulled out my phone to record her stealing my vehicle in broad daylight. She backed out with that same smug smile she always wore when she thought she was untouchable. What she did not know was that 3 federal agents were watching from an unmarked van just 20 feet away. I had lived in Cedar Ridge for 15 years. It was the kind of small town where everyone knew your name and your business. I worked hard, paid my taxes, and kept to myself. My pride and joy was a 1985 Jeep CJ7 that I had restored over 3 years. Every weekend, you could find me under the hood or polishing the chrome bumpers until they gleamed like mirrors. The Jeep was not just a vehicle to me. It was a connection to my late father, who had taught me everything about engines and hard work. When he passed, I bought that rusted shell of a Jeep and brought it back to life. Every bolt, every wire, every coat of paint was a tribute to the man who raised me right. I always parked downtown near the courthouse when I had business in the government district. There was a small lot behind the library where I could chain the Jeep to a metal post. The chain was heavy-duty, the kind used for motorcycles. I had learned to be careful after too many stories about vehicle theft in neighboring towns. My first real encounter with Sheriff Karen happened on a Tuesday morning in March. She pulled me over for allegedly running a stop sign that I knew I had not run. I sat in my truck, hands on the wheel, watching her swagger up to my window like she owned the world. "License and registration," she said without greeting or explanation. "Yes, ma'am. Can you tell me what I did wrong?" Her eyes narrowed behind her mirrored sunglasses. "You questioning my judgment, citizen?" The way she said "citizen" made my skin crawl, like I was beneath her, like my tax dollars did not pay her salary. I handed over my documents and kept my mouth shut. She took her sweet time running my information, making me sit there for 20 minutes while she found nothing wrong with my record. "Drive more carefully next time," she said, handing back my license with a look that promised this would not be our last encounter. What I did not know then was that federal agents had been conducting surveillance operations in our area for months. A multi-agency task force was investigating corruption and drug trafficking that crossed state lines. They had unmarked vehicles positioned throughout the downtown area, watching and recording everything that happened near the courthouse. 3 weeks later, I walked out of the courthouse after renewing my business license. The spring air was warm, and I was looking forward to taking the Jeep for a drive through the mountains. But when I reached the parking area behind the library, my heart stopped. The Jeep was gone. The heavy chain lay on the ground, cut clean through with industrial bolt cutters. The metal post stood there like a headstone, mocking me with its emptiness. I stared at the scene for a full minute, not believing what I was seeing. My first thought was theft. My second thought was insurance. My third thought was calling the police. I dialed 911 with shaking hands. "Cedar Ridge Police Department, how can I help you?" "My vehicle has been stolen from the parking area behind the library. Someone cut my chain and took my Jeep." 20 minutes later, Deputy Martinez arrived. He was a young officer, maybe 25, with honest eyes and a genuine concern for my situation. He took photos of the cut chain and wrote down all the details of my vintage Jeep. "Any idea who might have done this?" he asked. "No, sir, but I have security footage from my dash cam that might help." That was when Deputy Martinez got an uncomfortable look on his face. He cleared his throat and looked around like he was afraid someone might overhear us. "Actually, sir, your vehicle was not stolen. It was impounded by order of Sheriff Karen. She had it towed this morning." The words hit me like a physical blow. Impounded for what? The report says it was abandoned and blocking traffic flow. I felt my blood pressure rising. Abandoned. I parked it here for 2 hours while I conducted business at the courthouse, and it was not blocking anything. Look at this parking area. There is plenty of room. Deputy Martinez shifted uncomfortably. I understand your frustration, sir, but you will need to speak with Sheriff Karen about getting it released. The impound lot was on the outskirts of town, a fenced area filled with rusted cars and broken dreams. Sheriff Karen stood near the gate, arms crossed, that same smug expression on her face. She looked like she had been expecting me. "You hear about that old Jeep?" she asked before I could speak. "Yes, ma'am. I would like to understand why my legally parked vehicle was impounded." Abandoned vehicle, creating a traffic hazard, Municipal Code 14-7. I had looked up Municipal Code 14-7 on my phone during the drive over. It applied to vehicles left on public property for more than 72 hours. My Jeep had been parked for less than 3 hours. "Sheriff, with respect, that code does not apply here. My vehicle was parked for a routine courthouse visit." Her smile turned cold. "Are you questioning my professional judgment?" "I am questioning the legal basis for this impound." "The legal basis is my authority as sheriff of this county. Your vehicle was creating a public safety hazard, and I used my discretion to remove it. If you have a problem with that, you can file a complaint." The impound fee was $300. The daily storage fee was $50. She wanted cash only, no checks or cards accepted. As I counted out the bills, Sheriff Karen watched me with the satisfaction of a cat who had just caught a mouse. "Drive more carefully next time," she said, using the exact same words from our traffic stop. That night I sat in my kitchen staring at the impound receipt. $300 for parking legally. $300 for the crime of existing in Sheriff Karen's world. I realized this was not about traffic flow or public safety. This was personal. This was a message. And the message was clear. I belonged to her now. The next morning, I walked into the Cedar Ridge Police Department with a formal complaint typed on 3 pages. I had documented everything: the legal parking space, the timing, the lack of traffic obstruction, the misapplication of municipal codes. I was prepared to fight this through proper channels. The desk sergeant, a tired-looking woman in her 50s, barely glanced at my paperwork. "Complaint against Sheriff Karen," she shook her head. "You need to file that with the county commission." At the county commission office, I was told to file with Internal Affairs. Internal Affairs told me to contact the district attorney. The district attorney's office suggested I hire a lawyer for a civil matter. Every door I knocked on led to another door, and every person I spoke with had the same look of discomfort when I mentioned Sheriff Karen's name. Deputy Martinez found me in the courthouse hallway after my 4th failed attempt to file a complaint. "Can I speak with you privately?" he asked, glancing around nervously. We walked outside to the parking area where my Jeep had been stolen. Martinez looked like a man carrying a heavy burden. "What you experienced is not unusual," he said quietly. "Sheriff Karen has been doing things like this for 2 years. She targets people she does not like and finds ways to make their lives difficult." "Then why does no one stop her?" "Because she has connections. Her brother-in-law is the county judge. Her cousin runs the towing company. Her husband owns the largest construction business in the county. Anyone who crosses her finds themselves facing mysterious fines, failed inspections, or worse." Deputy Martinez told me about other victims. A local mechanic who questioned her authority during a traffic stop, found his business license suspended for bogus environmental violations. A teacher who filed a complaint against her had her car mysteriously keyed every week until she transferred to another district. A retired veteran who challenged her at a town meeting discovered his property taxes had been recalculated and owed back payments that nearly cost him his house. What about the other deputies, the chief of police? Chief Reynolds retired early last year after Sheriff Karen made his life hell. The other deputies are too scared to speak up. Karen decides who gets overtime, who gets promotions, who gets transferred to the night shift in the bad part of town. The systematic nature of the corruption was breathtaking. Sheriff Karen had built a network of fear and favoritism that protected her from any consequences. She was not just a bad cop. She was a criminal with a badge, and the entire system was designed to shield her from accountability. That evening, I called my cousin who worked as a state trooper in the Capitol. I told him the whole story and asked for advice. "Document everything," he said. "Take photos, keep records, record conversations if you can legally do so. But be careful. Small-town corruption runs deep, and people like Sheriff Karen do not hesitate to escalate when they feel threatened." What about the state police, the FBI? They would need evidence of federal crimes, civil rights violations, drug trafficking, something that crosses state lines. Local corruption is usually handled at the local level, which means you are stuck in the same system that protects her. I hung up the phone feeling more isolated than ever. The system was not broken. It was working exactly as designed. Sheriff Karen was not an aberration. She was the natural result of unchecked power in a small town where everyone looked the other way. But I was not everyone, and I was not going to look the other way. I started my investigation the way any good citizen would, with public records and patience. The courthouse kept files on all property transfers, business licenses, and legal proceedings. I spent my lunch hours there, reading through documents and building a timeline of Sheriff Karen's activities. What I found was disturbing. Since taking office, Sheriff Karen had dramatically increased impound revenues for the county. Vehicle seizures were up 300% compared to the previous sheriff. The towing company that benefited from these seizures was owned by her family. The impound lot charged fees that were double the state average. It was a perfect system of legalized theft. I started talking to people around town, carefully and discreetly. I learned that I was not the only victim. At the diner on Main Street, I met Carl, a truck driver who had his rig impounded for improper parking while he was delivering supplies to the courthouse. The impound fees cost him 2 weeks of work. At the hardware store, I spoke with Maria, whose teenage son had been arrested for suspicious behavior while walking home from school. The arrest was dropped, but not before she paid $500 in legal fees and her son was suspended from school for 3 days. These stories had a pattern. Sheriff Karen targeted people who could not fight back effectively, working-class folks, minorities, anyone without political connections. She avoided targeting the wealthy families who owned the big farms and businesses. Her corruption was strategic and deliberate. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. While researching property records, I noticed unusual activity around several downtown buildings. Federal agencies had been quietly leasing office space and storage facilities throughout the area. The leases were hidden behind shell companies, but the addresses matched locations where I had seen unmarked vehicles with government plates. I started paying closer attention to the federal presence in town. During my daily walks, I noted the positions of unmarked cars and observed the patterns of unfamiliar faces. These were not tourists or traveling salesmen. These were law enforcement professionals conducting surveillance operations. The final piece of the puzzle came from my cousin at the state police. He called me back after making some discreet inquiries. "There is something big happening in your area," he said. "I cannot give you details, but there is a federal task force investigating corruption and drug trafficking in several rural counties. They have been building cases for over a year." "Does this involve Sheriff Karen?" "I cannot say, but if she is involved in anything illegal, they would already know about it. These federal guys do not miss much." That night, I sat in my kitchen with a legal pad and wrote out everything I knew. Sheriff Karen was running a systematic extortion scheme using her authority as sheriff. She had corrupted the local system to protect herself. But federal agents were watching, and they were building cases against corruption in our area. The plan began to form in my mind. If I could document Sheriff Karen committing crimes while federal agents were watching, I could bypass the corrupt local system entirely. I needed to create a situation where she would reveal her true nature in front of witnesses who could not be bought or intimidated. I spent the next week studying her patterns. Sheriff Karen patrolled downtown every morning between 9 and 11. She always checked the parking areas behind the courthouse and library. She was predictable in her need to control and intimidate. The plan was risky. If it failed, Sheriff Karen would make my life even more difficult. But if it succeeded, I could finally get justice not just for myself, but for all her victims. The federal agents would have their evidence, and Sheriff Karen would finally face consequences for her actions. I was going to use her own corrupt nature against her. I was going to give her an opportunity to commit crimes in front of federal law enforcement, and I was going to make sure she took that opportunity. Setting the trap required careful planning and perfect timing. I spent 3 days mapping out the federal surveillance positions downtown. The unmarked vans were always parked with clear sightlines to the courthouse and surrounding areas. Their positions rotated, but they always maintained visual coverage of the government district. I chose a Wednesday morning for my plan. Sheriff Karen's patrol schedule was predictable, and federal activity seemed heaviest during weekday business hours. I arrived downtown at 8:30, giving myself time to position everything perfectly. The key was making the setup look natural while ensuring maximum visibility for the federal agents. I parked my Jeep in the same spot behind the library where Sheriff Karen had impounded it before. This time, I used an even heavier chain and a more visible lock. I wanted her to see it as a challenge. But this time was different. This time I had backup plans. I installed a small camera in the Jeep's dashboard, positioned to record anyone who approached the vehicle. I had my phone ready to film from a distance. Most importantly, I had informed my cousin at the state police about my plan, asking him to monitor police radio traffic for any unusual activity. At 9:15, I positioned myself across the street with a clear view of the parking area. 2 unmarked federal vehicles were within 50 yards of my Jeep. If Sheriff Karen took the bait, everything would be recorded by multiple agencies. The waiting was agony. Every minute felt like an hour. I watched normal people going about their business, unaware that a trap was about to spring in their quiet town. A mother walked her child to the library. An elderly man fed pigeons near the courthouse steps. Life continued while I prepared to expose the corruption that had poisoned our community. At 9:47, Sheriff Karen's patrol car turned the corner. My heart rate spiked as she drove slowly through the downtown area, scanning parked vehicles like a predator looking for prey. She circled the block twice before parking near the courthouse. I watched her get out of her patrol car, and walked deliberately toward the library parking area. She saw my Jeep immediately. Even from across the street, I could see her facial expression change from casual patrol to focused aggression. She stood next to my vehicle for a full minute, studying the chain and lock like she was planning her approach. Sheriff Karen walked back to her patrol car and opened the trunk. She pulled out a large pair of bolt cutters, the same industrial-strength tools she had used before. She looked around briefly, but her arrogance made her careless. She never noticed the federal agents watching from their unmarked positions. I started recording with my phone as she approached my Jeep with the bolt cutters. My hands were shaking, but I kept the camera steady. This was the moment that would determine everything. Sheriff Karen positioned the bolt cutters on my chain and applied pressure. The metal snapped with a sharp crack that echoed off the surrounding buildings. She tossed the broken chain aside with the same casual indifference she had shown before. She opened the driver's door of my Jeep and climbed inside. The engine started immediately. She backed out of the parking space with that familiar smug smile, completely unaware that she was being recorded by multiple law enforcement agencies. As she drove my stolen Jeep toward the impound lot, I felt a mixture of rage and anticipation. She was doing exactly what I had hoped she would do. She was committing multiple felonies in broad daylight while federal agents documented every moment. But the trap was not complete yet. I needed her to finish the crime. I needed her to impound my vehicle using false pretenses while federal witnesses watched. I needed her to demand illegal fees and threaten me with more harassment. I needed Sheriff Karen to be herself, completely and without reservation, in front of people who could not be corrupted or intimidated. The next phase of my plan was about to begin. I drove to the impound lot with my phone still recording. The federal agents had to know what was happening by now. Sheriff Karen's theft of my vehicle in broad daylight was impossible to miss. I could only hope they were prepared to act on what they had witnessed. Sheriff Karen was waiting for me at the impound lot gate, leaning against her patrol car with the same arrogant posture she always used. My Jeep sat behind the fence like a prisoner of war. She had done this so many times that it was routine for her now. "Back again," she said with mock surprise. "Seems like you have a problem with proper parking procedures." "Sheriff, you just stole my vehicle from a legal parking space. I have it recorded on video." Her smile never wavered. "Abandoned vehicle removal is part of my duties. Municipal Code 14.7 gives me full authority to remove traffic hazards." My vehicle was not abandoned. I was across the street conducting business. "Prove it in court," she said, pulling out her citation book. "But first, you need to pay the impound fees. $400 today. Daily storage is $60 starting tomorrow." "400. Last time it was 300. "Inflation," she said with a shrug. "Plus, repeat offenders pay a penalty fee." I could not believe her audacity. She was increasing the extortion amount while federal agents were potentially watching. Her corruption was so systematic that she felt completely immune to consequences. "I am not paying extortion fees for legal parking," I said firmly. Sheriff Karen's expression hardened. "Then your vehicle stays here until you do, and the storage fees keep adding up. After 30 days, we can auction it for unpaid fees." She was threatening to steal my Jeep permanently now. The vehicle my father had inspired me to restore. The symbol of everything honest and hardworking in my life. She was going to auction it off to pay her corrupt impound fees. "You cannot do this," I said, my voice rising. "This is theft. This is extortion. This is abuse of authority." "This is law enforcement," she replied coldly. "And if you keep running your mouth, I can find other violations to cite you for: disorderly conduct, obstruction of justice, resisting arrest." She was threatening to arrest me for demanding my legal rights in front of potential federal witnesses. Her arrogance had made her completely reckless. That was when I heard the vehicles approaching. 3 black SUVs with government plates turned into the impound lot. Federal agents in tactical gear emerged from each vehicle with the precision of a military operation. Sheriff Karen's confident smile disappeared like ice in boiling water. Sheriff Karen Miller, the lead agent, was a woman in her 40s with the calm authority of someone who had done this many times before. "FBI, you are under arrest for civil rights violations, extortion, and theft under color of authority." Sheriff Karen's face went through a series of expressions: confusion, anger, denial, and finally panic. "This is my jurisdiction. You have no authority here." "Federal crimes are our jurisdiction everywhere," the agent replied calmly. "You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." As they placed handcuffs on Sheriff Karen, she looked at me with pure hatred. "You set me up," she hissed. "You planned this whole thing." "I just gave you the opportunity to be yourself," I replied. "You chose to commit crimes." The lead FBI agent approached me as her colleagues loaded Sheriff Karen into one of the SUVs. "Mr. Johnson, Agent Sarah Martinez, FBI, we need to speak with you about your experiences with Sheriff Miller." "How long have you been investigating her?" 18 months. We have been building cases against corruption in several rural counties. Sheriff Miller was one of our primary targets." I watched the SUV carrying Sheriff Karen disappear down the road. The woman who had terrorized our community was finally facing consequences for her actions. But I realized this was just the beginning. The investigation would expose the entire network of corruption that had protected her. "What happens now?" I asked Agent Martinez. "Now we clean house," she said, "and you get your vehicle back." The news of Sheriff Karen's arrest spread through Cedar Ridge like wildfire. By evening, everyone in town was talking about the FBI raid at the impound lot. The local newspaper ran a front-page story with the headline, "Sheriff Arrested on Federal Corruption Charges." Within hours of her arrest, other victims began coming forward. Deputy Martinez called me that evening to tell me about the flood of complaints pouring into the police department. "People are finally talking," he said. "They are not afraid anymore. We have had 27 formal complaints filed against Sheriff Karen in the past 6 hours." The federal investigation expanded rapidly. Agent Martinez contacted me the next day to schedule a formal interview about my experiences. She explained that my case was part of a much larger pattern of corruption that the FBI had been documenting. Sheriff Miller was running a systematic extortion scheme, Agent Martinez explained. She targeted vulnerable citizens, used her authority to steal their property, and split the profits with her family members who owned the towing and impound operations. The scope of the corruption was staggering. Over 18 months, Sheriff Karen had illegally impounded over 300 vehicles. She had collected nearly $200,000 in illegal fees. She had filed false police reports, perjured herself in court, and used her position to intimidate witnesses. But the federal investigation revealed even more serious crimes. Sheriff Karen had been providing protection to drug dealers who paid her monthly fees. She had been selling seized drugs back to dealers instead of destroying them as required by law. She had been accepting bribes to reduce charges and dismiss cases. The local newspaper interviewed me for a follow-up story about my role in exposing Sheriff Karen's crimes. I was careful to emphasize that I was just one victim among many. "I got lucky," I told the reporter. "The federal agents were already watching when she stole my Jeep. Other people suffered for years because they had no one to turn to." The interview was published with the headline, "Local Man's Courage Helps Expose Sheriff's Corruption." While I appreciated the recognition, I was uncomfortable with being called a hero. I had just refused to accept injustice when it happened to me. The community reaction was complex. Many people were relieved that Sheriff Karen's reign of terror was over, but others were embarrassed that their town had been exposed as corrupt. Some blamed me for bringing negative attention to Cedar Ridge. The mayor called a town meeting to address the crisis. The courthouse was packed with angry citizens demanding answers about how Sheriff Karen had been allowed to operate unchecked for so long. "This is a wake-up call for our community," the mayor said. "We allowed one person to accumulate too much power without accountability. That stops now." The state attorney general announced that her office would review every case Sheriff Karen had been involved in during her tenure. Dozens of convictions were overturned. Hundreds of illegal fines were refunded. The entire criminal justice system in our county had to be rebuilt from scratch. Deputy Martinez was appointed as interim sheriff, while the county conducted a search for permanent leadership. He immediately implemented new policies requiring body cameras, external oversight, and regular audits of all police activities. "We are going to earn back the trust of this community," he announced at his first press conference. "No one is above the law, and no one should have to live in fear of those who are sworn to protect them." The healing process would take time, but justice was finally being served. 6 months later, I sat in a federal courthouse watching Sheriff Karen face justice. She had plea bargained to avoid a lengthy trial, but the charges were still serious. Civil rights violations, extortion, theft under color of authority, drug trafficking, and racketeering. The federal judge was a stern woman who had clearly studied the case thoroughly. As she read the charges, Sheriff Karen stood with her shoulders slumped, no longer the arrogant bully who had terrorized our community. "Sheriff Miller," the judge said, "you took an oath to serve and protect the citizens of your county. Instead, you preyed upon them systematically for personal profit. You violated the most fundamental principles of law enforcement and betrayed the trust placed in you." The sentence was 15 years in federal prison, with no possibility of parole for 10 years. Sheriff Karen would also forfeit her pension, pay restitution to all her victims, and face permanent disbarment from law enforcement. At 52 years old, her career and her freedom were over. As the bailiff led her away in handcuffs, Sheriff Karen looked back at the courtroom filled with her former victims. There was no smug smile now, no arrogant confidence, just the hollow look of someone who had finally faced consequences for their actions. My civil lawsuit against the county was settled out of court for $75,000. The money was nice, but more important was the systemic change that resulted from the federal investigation. New oversight procedures were implemented. Independent auditors would review all police activities quarterly. Citizens' rights training became mandatory for all law enforcement personnel. Deputy Martinez won the election for sheriff by a landslide. His first act was to establish a citizens' oversight committee with real authority to investigate complaints. His second act was to fire every employee who had been complicit in Sheriff Karen's corruption. "We are rebuilding this department from the ground up," he told me during our first meeting after his election. "What happened to you and others cannot happen again." The impound lot was shut down permanently. The towing company owned by Sheriff Karen's family lost its contracts and went out of business. The entire network of corruption that had protected her was dismantled piece by piece. Other victims of Sheriff Karen's crimes received justice as well. Carl, the truck driver, got his impound fees refunded and received damages for lost wages. Maria's son had his arrest record expunged and received a formal apology from the county. Dozens of other victims were compensated for the illegal fines and fees they had been forced to pay. The federal investigation also led to charges against other corrupt officials in neighboring counties. Sheriff Karen's case became a template for prosecuting small-town corruption throughout the region. The ripple effects of justice spread far beyond Cedar Ridge. 1 year after Sheriff Karen's arrest, I was invited to speak at a conference on police accountability. I told the audience of law enforcement officials and civic leaders about the importance of standing up to corruption, even when the system seems designed to protect it. Evil thrives when good people do nothing, I said. But when we refuse to accept injustice, when we document the truth and demand accountability, we can change everything. My restored Jeep still runs perfectly. I drive it through the mountains on weekends, remembering my father and the values he taught me about hard work and integrity. Sometimes I park it behind the library, in the same spot where Sheriff Karen used to steal it. But now it is just a parking space, not a symbol of oppression. Justice was served, our community was healed, and Sheriff Karen learned that in America, no one is above the law.